And before we get going, here's a word about our sponsors. SDHQ Motorsports is a powerhouse 30,000 square foot facility with 45 family members reporting for duty. This single owner, single location business is based out of Gilbert, Arizona. It can handle anything from a hot rod, daily driver, pre-runner, race vehicle, half-track or Kugelwagen, or just about any other project you need help with. Their skilled staff with hundreds of years of combined experience eats, sleeps, and breathes performance. So go check them out at sdhqmotorsports.com or check them out on Insta at sdhqmotorsports. The We Happy Few 506 podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Gettysburg Museum of History, home of the Major Dick Winters collection and the largest assortment of authentic Band of Brothers artifacts in the world. Visit the free museum at 219 Baltimore Street in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, or at www.gettysburgmuseumofhistory.com, and on the YouTube channel, The History Underground, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
We few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
Well, hello and welcome along to another We Happy Few 506 podcast, The Nearly Men. It's quite a sophisticated one this evening, so buckle yourselves in. And it doesn't just smell entirely of dude like most of our podcasts do. We've actually got a sophisticated lady on the show today, so I'm dressed properly, I'm prepared, I wrote all my notes with a fountain pen, which means I can't read them, which is a bit of an error on my part. Anyway, I'm joined, as always, by my beautiful co-host, Doug, in Berlin. How you doing, mate?
Oh, I'm very well, thank you, Matt. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for asking.
Good.
And I'd like to introduce our guest today, which proves that we do have interests outside World War II and or people blowing things up. Today's guest is the author, Angela John, and we're going to talk about her latest book, The Dramatic Lives of Philip Burton. How you doing, Angela?
I'm fine, thank you.
Where are you?
Sorry?
Where are you?
I'm in West Wales, in North Pembrokeshire.
Right. What's
Lovely.
weather good?
Could be better, but I mean, it's dry, so that's something.
Yeah.
You shouldn't ask that question to people who live in Wales, Matthew. You've got to know that answer. It's a beautiful part of the world, though, Angela. Welcome
It is.
to the show.
Okay, so first and foremost, and I promise this is my only facetious question, your second name is John.
hmm
You're not by any chance related to Barry John, are you?
No, but I met him once and he said us Johns must stick together. So, I mean, it's quite a common name in Wales. I did meet the number 10, Barry John. Yeah.
I've got a Barry John story, actually, other than the fact that I wasn't allowed to call my son Barry John. I fought long and hard for this, but it was a no. When I was at drama school, actually, there was a girl in the year below me who kind of fancied me, and I didn't fancy her, which is a shame because then my mate started dating her, and it turned out her uncle was Barry John. So that's that. So
That's the story.
yes, good story. Hey, oh,
The love life of Matthew Leach. We could have an entire podcast on that, but it wouldn't be that interesting.
Yes. So let's start out with your book. What drew you to Philip Burton as a character, his work, his legacy, the man himself? What was your jumping off point? What got you sucked in?
Well, I'm from Port Talbot originally, which is where, of course, he taught for 20 years. But I really got interested because I'd written an earlier book called The Actor's Crucible, which was about how and why this steel town became a town of stars as well as steel. And, you know, Richard Burton, Anthony Hopkins, Michael Sheen, Rob Brydon, you can go on and on. And after it came out, I had letters from quite a lot of people in their 80s, some in their early 90s, telling me just how inspirational Philip Burton had been as a teacher. He was an untrained teacher. He'd studied maths. He hadn't studied English or drama, but he became this drama teacher or literature teacher who really had a huge impact, not just on the lad who became Richard Burton and took his name, but also on a whole number of pupils and a number of people who, some of whom went to RADA, others carried on doing drama for the rest of their lives, and a number of them became actors. So I was interested in this person because clearly he was the catalyst and he was the person who really kick-started this remarkable development in my hometown. So I think that was what initially attracted me to wanting to find out more about him. And I, when I began, I just found he'd had this remarkable life of his own, quite apart from the teaching side of it and quite apart from the impact he had on young people for the rest of his life. And it was a long life, it virtually spanned the 20th century. There he was managing to really have a huge impact on not just potential actors, but also on writers. And it was a transatlantic life. What was
Hmm.
more amazing is that he too, like Richard Burton, was a coal miner's son.
Right.
You'd probably have known it if you'd listened to him, but he was somebody who'd had a really tough childhood and then kept reinventing himself.
Yeah. I, I, I'd like to go back to that and your first book and talking about the steel town and wonder whether you personally sort of got to the nub of why a place like that is such a sort of a spring of this incredible talent, and whether or not part of it is this is just my theory is a collective. They're very tight knit communities. Coal mining towns, steel mining towns, very tight knit communities, very proud communities. Um, and there's a sort of is there an element of like a guy maybe escaping that hard lifestyle, and then people backing them and saying, "You go out there and represent us."
Yeah, to a certain extent, the unusual thing about Port Talbot, though, is that it's a coastal town. It's not in the valleys. It's not somewhere that, in a sense, is based on coal mining primarily. It's actually steel that's been it's really up until now, sadly, has been what's really, in a sense, been where people have worked. They've also worked in the copper trade. There's a whole number of industries. But I think that what's interesting is that whereas typical valleys towns, it's difficult to often to get away from them because they have one road, they're often fairly cut off. A town like Port Talbot, being on the coast, it was easy to get to and from, and people came into that town from other places. So, in some ways, it was more open, perhaps, to alternative ways of thinking than perhaps towns that are more cut off. But I think there's also the fact that, but I mean, there is clearly some truth in the fact that some people would want to be escaping a life in the steelworks or down the mine, for
Mhm.
sure. Sorry, like
But wasn't a creative pursuit, wasn't that quite common in amongst those mining communities? They all had brass bands, they all had a community centre. Working men's clubs were designed almost specifically for that. They would have comedy, they would have folk music, they would have, there'd always be a kind of creative outlet with that. And do you think sort of Philip, but just because he was a teacher, do you reckon that he was just kind of plugging into that and just sort of teaching a younger generation that then enabled them, like you say, because it was on the coast, because you could potentially see beyond the borders of your own existence, that armed then with these creative outlets, it gave them the kind of the sort of passport, if you like, to go and investigate the rest of the world and pursue the hobbies rather than I did. I come from a line of carpenters. It was six generations, so it's a very similar kind of thing where you kind of grow up and you're expected to do a particular thing, and if you have a creative outlet, did did sort of Philip Burton kind of was he like the bedrock in sort of giving people the confidence to go, no, don't go out being a miner and go and work in a different town. Go out being a musician or go out being an actor or go out with this and really investigate it. Because it was all sort of would I be right in saying there was already a sort of a community there that was kind of rife for the taking, if you will, to pursue these other things, these creative things.
I think you're absolutely right that there was certainly a lot of creative spirit, and all kinds of theatre groups would come and
Mm,
visit these towns. One of the things that was really active, and of course, this is before television, was that visiting theatre companies, people like Sybil Thorndike would visit South Wales and perform. And certainly Philip Burton, who came from Mountain Ash, which was in the Cynon Valley, so he was a Valleys boy,
mm,
he grew up on that. And that was what inspired him to love drama. So you're absolutely right that there is that sort of creative impulse. And there were all these competitions that were held between different towns, and Port Talbot and the YMCA was very involved in all that kind of thing. So
mm,
that was definitely there. And another factor was that the local authority, Labour authority, was predisposed towards drama. So it's really quite interesting. The local Glamorgan County Council was really quite progressive in encouraging and helping develop schools to have drama facilities and to have,
mm.
put on plays. So
Interesting.
there was an encouragement, as
Mm,
well as, I think in the case of Port Talbot and Philip Burton, what really happened as well was that he managed, because he was also somebody who wanted to write, he was writing radio scripts from the 30s for the BBC in Cardiff. And he was
mm.
giving young pupils the opportunity through radio to actually take part in radio programs. And he would literally drive them to Cardiff. Actually, going in a car was probably part of them. But, that was an hour away. And they would be supplying boys from the school to have parts in plays that Philip was writing. So
Cool.
that again was another outlet. So there were a whole number of things that sort of came together, if you like.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? And suppose in that perspective, in that time, that must have been like visiting another world, wasn't it? Just going into a recording studio and meeting people that were obviously a different class and and performing in front. Do you know what I mean? It must have been a world away from, this kind of tight lineage of, you're going to do what your dad did, son, and all this kind of thing that must have been prevalent then as well.
Yes, to a certain extent, except radio itself was still fairly new. And I
Mm,
think radio in Wales, what's interesting is if you look at the backgrounds of quite a few of the influential people there, they were not all from middle class backgrounds by any stretch of imagination. They found it very, very different from London when they
right.
did come across Broadcasting House and London, because the person who had a huge influence on Philip, for example, was a slate quarry worker's son, and he'd become a producer.
Oh,
So,
wow.
so I think there was more social mobility in a sense.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, you are absolutely right. I mean, going into a studio, even though it was still early days,
Yeah.
actually, it was when radio, Philip was really working there when radio came into its own, because there wasn't, the wireless was everything. There was
Yeah.
even during the war, there was no television service in Wales. So,
Yeah.
um, you know,
Wow.
it was pretty important. Yeah.
These
Exciting.
these competitions that you spoke of, is that, have I got that right? Is that called an Eisteddfod? All right.
No, well, the Eisteddfod is, you have a national Eisteddfod, and that is the sort of the national festival of music and drama and dance and everything that takes place once a year. You did have local Eisteddfodau, as they'd be called, but a lot of these competitions were not so much in Welsh. Well, some were in Welsh, but a lot of them were in English. They were simply local competitions that were held by local drama societies. In Port Talbot, quite a lot of that was linked to the YMCA, where Philip, again, this ubiquitous Philip Burton, would crop up and he would write plays, but also they would take part in these competitions right across the county and sometimes beyond. So, um, an Eisteddfod is broader. It's not just drama, but these were actual drama competitions where you wouldn't put on a whole play. You might just do a scene or two from a play.
Right. Do you know what? Sorry to interrupt. It's fascinating, especially I'm sure Doug's finding this fascinating that that must be a peculiarly Welsh phenomena that you have these very working class mining towns and steel, heavy metal towns and heavy labor towns where drama and expression and that sort of outlet just run hand in hand. Like in England, if you worked in a sort of similar business and you went to a drama festival, you get your head kicked in, wouldn't you, Dan?
I have a feeling parts of Yorkshire and Lancashire might actually have had not dissimilar competitions in drama. Where there's a strong community basis, I think, in different places. I think that often does lead to these kind of things. But it was particularly marked in South Wales for sure.
Fascinating. As a Yorkshireman, out of the Welsh dad, I find those things both fascinating. Um, yeah, so did Philip, so he was teaching and writing scripts for the BBC at the same time. At what point does he run into Dylan Thomas, or does he just sort of champion his work to the BBC?
Well, Dylan Thomas actually came to see him when Philip was doing, he hardly did any training, but he did a tiny bit in London when he was, um, you know, working in features. He became a full-time producer in 1945. He left school teaching after 2 decades. And when he was briefly in London, Dylan Thomas came to see him.
Wow.
And of course, he had a reputation for cadging and for trying to, um, he wanted to be given work and he wanted to be paid as much as possible for it. Actually, what's interesting is that although they were very different personalities, the two men got on rather well. And Philip did, he not only produced a very iconic piece of work of Dylan Thomas's called Return Journey in 1947, but he also met him quite frequently. And in fact, just a few days before he went on that fatal final trip to America,
Yeah.
they were talking about his plans, and Philip discussed with him, of course, earlier some of the ideas for what became Under Milk Wood. So it's very interesting how much kind of connection there was there. But Return Journey was a really interesting program because it had it was a case of it was part of a series, and what happened was that that was commissioned from London, that Philip produced it, and it involved going back to Swansea, which had been badly blitzed during the war, and Dylan
Mm.
Thomas revisiting his old haunts and his old friends and a lot of his childhood and ruminating about this. Well, when it came to, after he wrote the script, he gave it to Philip, and Philip sent it to Philip, and Philip recognized that it was a little bit short. It wasn't quite long enough. So he invited Dylan Thomas to come and stay with him. By this time, Philip was living in Cardiff, in lodgings in Cardiff.
Dangerous. Go on. Yeah.
Went to Cardiff, and he said he got in a crate of Guinness, thinking that, he'd want to drink a lot, but actually he didn't touch a drop of it. Um, Philip kept insisting how well behaved he was, but he did say to him that it needed a few more minutes. And of course, he wasn't somebody, Dylan Thomas, who wrote quickly or to order. So he said, well, he'd have difficulty doing this. But they decided to carve up the work between them. So Philip actually wrote one scene that was set in a secondhand bookshop. And in the iconic radio version of Under Milk Wood, and in various other things, Philip, played quite a part. He was the Reverend Eli Jenkins in the radio, the famous radio production, but he'd also written a few minutes of Return Journey. When that was broadcast, Philip's words were used, but it wasn't used in the published version of Return Journey. But nevertheless, Philip Burton did contribute to this rather wonderful program in which Dylan Thomas sort of revisits his younger self, and it's really worth
Extraordinary.
listening.
Yeah.
Dylan Thomas, another name I wasn't allowed to call my son. Oh, I tried with that as well. How so? Yeah, just to follow on from that. So was Dylan was he going to America anyway, or uh, was Philip instrumental in getting him a wider audience to America?
He'd already got a commission to do work in America that final time. He'd been before, and this final time, well, he didn't know it was the final time, of course, but he died there, and of course, um, famously, that that was where all kinds of stories circulated about what had caused his death, really heavy drinking and everything else. But no, that was independent of Philip, and Philip went. uh, Dylan Thomas went in 53. It was the following year that Philip went to the States, and he wasn't deliberately emigrating at that point. He was actually, what he decided to do, he loved America. I mean, he had a thing about the American dream. He'd first gone there in 1939 on a sabbatical, and he'd gone most summers whenever he could, or during his vacation, um, when the BBC would let him go. And then he made a few programs that were radio programs that were kind of looking at rural America. And then in 1954, by this time he'd gone to work for the BBC, as I said, in 1945. But the mid-century, he got a job in London with the BBC, and that was really in admin and doing training for BBC recruits. And he stuck it for a year or so, but it wasn't that creative. Whereas in Cardiff, he'd been producing and he'd been writing, and he was responsible altogether over the years for almost 200 programs. But the BBC job in London, he didn't like all that much, so he left it and went freelance. So he was back writing again. And in 1954, he decided to go to the States initially for another long holiday. But of course, he didn't really have a job because he was freelance. When he got to the States, he actually initially got a job which was working, well, in a sense, in the film industry, but I think the people who employed him are really more interested in trying to use him as a line to get to Richard. And various jobs didn't quite work out, but he started plays, it was drama he really loved. And so what he started doing was to he directed some plays, off-Broadway plays. In fact, Sean O'Casey's longest running play, Purple Dust, he put that on. And then he also became the founder and first director of a drama school called the American Musical and Dramatic Academy in New York. So he ran this drama school for some years. I've listened to some of his lectures, which are just amazing. I mean, he was entrancing his audiences, his students, with these amazing lectures and talks that he gave about playwrights, about plays. And half the time he would be because he was also an actor, and he would be acting out little scenes from them. And you can, on some of these audio tapes, you can actually hear them clapping, and the students clearly loved this, and so that was something he became really adept at doing. And he also gave Shakespearean recitals right across the States. And sometimes he'd be talking for about 2 hours without a note, and again acting out what he was talking about. So he's passionate about Shakespeare and about drama.
What stage did he, that Richard Burton, I mean, what did he see in him, and what age was he when he met him? So Richard was one of his students, and I thought, when he went to America, didn't he go, because he stayed in Richard Burton's career for quite a long time. Did he not go there with him, or was it completely separate thing? Or, you know, how did, how do you spot something? I mean, obviously you can see it. I mean, you see students sometimes, or I meet students, and you can see when there's just a glow around an individual that you kind of, know that they're going to make it. I mean, did he make any remarks on Richard Burton about how when he first saw him, or?
Well, the first time he met him, Richard was in the junior school and Philip was teaching the senior pupils.
Hmm.
And there was an audition for one of these radio programs about Shakespeare, in fact, an audition in the school. And Richard went along, and Philip dismissed him very easily because the BBC wanted a boy who could speak, in effect, English with an English accent.
Right.
And Richard had a very strong Port Talbot accent. So Philip didn't really want to know. But what happened was that not long after that, Richard had to leave school because it was a depression. It was times were pretty tough. And he'd been brought up by his older sister and her husband because his mother had died when he was only 2 and his father was an alcoholic. He was one of originally 13 children, but 2 died in infancy. And the youngest child who was born and his mother died almost immediately went to the eldest son, and Richard went to the eldest daughter. And
Hmm.
he was only 2, and Cis, as she was known, her name was Cecilia, brought him up. But at the point where Richard should really have been studying in school, they decided to take him out of school and get him a job in a local co-op because there was a job there in the haberdashery department very near where they were living. Richard hated it with an absolute passion. I mean, he would have far preferred to have gone down the pit, to be honest. So it was a masculine job. But it did mean that he'd had to leave school prematurely
Hmm.
before his national certificate. And he was pretty unhappy with this. Philip and a number of other people in the film Mr. Burton, it's only Philip who's responsible for this, but actually, to be fair, there were about 3 other people who were also concerned about Richard and that he shouldn't have left school. They all managed somehow to get him back to school with a scholarship. I mean, to get the education authority to agree and the school itself, which is pretty
Hmm.
remarkable to go back to school when you've left.
Hmm.
And he is taken back into school. And at that point, Philip begins to take much more notice of him. Richard is determined to kind of, succeed. And I think partly he recognizes that what really impels and drives Philip Burton is a love of drama.
Hmm.
How much Richard really himself had a passion for drama at this point isn't quite so clear, but certainly he got involved in the school play. And he was soon, because every year Philip put on an amazing school play that was usually Shakespeare or Shaw, very high standard. I mean,
Yeah, but that's the power, Angela, of a very powerful, passionate teacher, isn't it?
just
Even if you're not initially interested in it, when someone conveys such passion, you see it with everything. If
absolutely.
someone's talking about a subject they're passionate about, whether I'm interested in it or not, you just get taken on a wave with it, don't you?
That's the thing. And so what happened is that, and he wasn't the only pupil. I mean, there's already been someone called Thomas Owen Jones who'd won a scholarship to RADA. Philip had taught, and he, by the mid 30s, he was acting with Michael Redgrave and all the greats in
Hmm.
London. But he
Wow.
sadly died during the war. And then there were a number of others as well. But clearly, Richard Jenkins had an innate talent of his own. He was very bright. And Philip started recognizing this and decided he would take him in charge and really, really train him. And Richard moved into the same digs that Philip was living in. So there was a space there. And Philip trained him. He took him up the mountain to learn how to project his voice across a distance. And he schooled him literally in the front room downstairs in this house in Port Talbot. Every day after class, there would be lessons. He would be learning how to enunciate well. And of course, in those days, if you wanted to get on, you had to learn how to speak in an accentless voice. You had to.
RP, isn't it? Yeah.
Was seen as essential. Philip himself had to undergo that. He trained himself. He was never trained himself as a teacher. He was someone he'd won a scholarship. It was scholarships that were his passport. His father had been killed in a pit accident when he was only 14. Philip had won a scholarship to university when he was only 16 and read pure maths. But in fact, he loved drama so much that most of the time he was in the real theatre, not the lecture theatre. So after that, he managed to get this job in the grammar school in Port Talbot, but he wasn't a trained teacher. But nevertheless, he was, as you say, passionate about his subject. Although initially he was appointed to teach maths, the head teacher, to his credit, recognised what really drove this man and transferred him to the literature department. So that was what had happened. But yes, after that, and it is a familiar trope in a sense, Emily Williams' play The Corn is Green, which is based on his own teacher, Miss Cook. And people like Stanley Baker had an influential teacher. All kinds of people had been influenced. But in the case of Richard, I think what really happened is that you get somebody who's pretty determined, pretty independent as well. Philip gives him this really rigorous training. And then the break does come. Emily Williams, Philip sees an advert for a job, for a post, a small acting part. And Emily Williams is amazed by this young actor who Philip has already sort of honed, if you like, and taught him in a very professional way. And the rest, in a sense, is history. But your rest of your question, when you were asking about Philip going to America, Richard, of course, initially was in Britain. He was in Stratford. He was at the Old Vic. And whenever he had problems with acting, he would call on Philip before he ever went to America.
Wow.
Anthony Quayle famously declared that when Richard Burton played Shakespeare, the director never directed him. Philip Burton always directed him. Whether he was doing it in person, and very often that happened. I mean, Richard had 6 months at Oxford as part of an RAF scholarship, and he was in Measure for Measure. But just before he was in it, who did he call up but Philip, who went rushing to Oxford and, spent a whole evening working with him. The same thing happened in Stratford, where he would help Richard out. The same thing happened at the Old Vic, where there was a famous season in the early 50s where Richard was playing all these parts. Again, it was Philip who would come to his rescue. And when Richard and Philip both ended up in America, of course, I don't think Philip went there solely because Richard was there, because at that point, Richard might not even have stayed there. I think what happened was that Philip loved the States. He wanted to be there. And at the same time, Richard happened to be there, which was pretty good for him. But also, and Richard quite often bailed him out financially when he was between jobs or whatever. But Philip really enjoyed living there, and he helped him again. I don't know whether you've seen the play The Motive and the Cue, which is about Richard and John Gielgud, who produced Hamlet on Broadway in 1964. But Philip again went to Toronto where the rehearsals were taking place and spent a weekend working with Richard. Also on stage, Camelot. At the beginning of the 60s, there were problems because the director was taken ill. Philip was brought in and literally came out from behind the scenes, which is the main title of my book, and helped to turn around Camelot with just in a few weeks. And Philip became known as the sort of backstage brains of Broadway because, he was helping out and helping to turn something whenever there were sort of problems. He wasn't a film man. He wasn't somebody who worked with Richard on films. But when it came to stage acting, he was the person to whom Richard always turned. And for the rest of Richard's life, he remained close to Philip. And Philip got to know all the different wives and was fond of all of them in turn. And Richard went and stayed in Key West, where Philip spent the last couple of decades of his life. And of course, Richard died quite a long time before Philip.
That's quite extraordinary. I'm just trying to sort of picture this relationship then. So he obviously, especially going from the West End to Broadway, there's be a lot of pressure on him. It's obviously any actor would recognize this is what you call a moment. This could lead to, a promising movie career, essentially. That's where they, and that he turns to Philip at sort of every opportunity. What was it about him then? Because it sounds to me like you're saying that there'd be some kind of mismatch between Richard and the director that Philip could kind of, that he would listen to Philip almost exclusively, or was it perhaps a shorthand that they had, just an understanding? Because obviously, if you know someone from when they're a child, you're going to know them very well. It must have been, Richard obviously massively trusted Philip with any professional kind of query or interpretation or anything creative. It sounds like it turned to him pretty much all the time. And
Well, yes and no, because really, Philip, of course, famously, to a large extent, turned his back on the theatre. I mean, it was films that became his real, that's what he spent most of his life in America making, and elsewhere as well. And that was not something that
mm,
Philip was especially interested in, and it wasn't something where
why not though? I don't understand why,
because
because
it was theatre.
especially if you're going to America, it is the land of the movie. There's a huge
Well,
it's a very similarity in style between theatre, which is like very stillness and voice acting, to films, and you could see that. You disagree?
I disagree. Philip, well, I mean, I'm not personally involved in all this, but I think Philip would have seen it as something very different. Remember, we're talking about, quite a long time ago now.
Mm,
Films were rather different from how they are
yeah,
today.
yeah.
And I think Philip loved the stage, loved acting, loved
Mm,
Shakespeare so much that the kind of films that were being made just
mm,
wouldn't have appealed to him in the same way. In some ways, maybe some of the radio programs he made were more akin to some of the filmic work in a sense, but I don't think that wasn't really his forte. And
mm,
Richard developed, I mean, I think Elizabeth taught him a lot about films actually.
yeah.
She'd been an actor since a child,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
she had an instinctive kind of understanding. But so, and by the way, Philip was especially close to Sybil, Richard's first wife, and there was a 2 year rift when during Cleopatra, the famous
Mm,
meeting of Elizabeth, and because Philip was so loyal to Sybil and her two children, he decided, he would side with Sybil, and he didn't speak to Richard for 2 years.
okay.
They got back in touch because Elizabeth, who hadn't met Philip at this point, I think very bravely recognized that Richard was having trouble with the Hamlet that he was rehearsing. And I think one of the difficulties was that Richard had become a film actor and he hadn't acted on stage for quite a while, and so it was quite difficult.
Right.
But Elizabeth, to her credit, phoned Philip up, never having met him, phoned him in New York and said, "Can you come to the rescue? Because
Wow.
Richard needs you." And Philip, he cursed himself forevermore afterwards because he felt he was rather cruel. He responded by saying, "Well, I will come if Sybil is happy with this." And he talked to Sybil, and to Sybil's credit, she said, "Yes, you must go and help Richard."
Yeah, I don't know how anyone could turn down Elizabeth
Um,
Taylor at that time.
and then, the breach was healed.
Yeah.
But it's quite nice. There's another really nice story about Cleopatra at the very beginning, before the film got off the ground, before they started filming, because it was such a huge, expensive venture. There's a lot of hanging around in making films. Richard invited Philip to go to Rome to stay with him for a few days, and his brother Ivor, Richard's brother Ivor, who worked for Richard in effect. And one day, because they hadn't started filming, one day they went to Pompeii, the three of them, in a car. And when they got there, they went to the amphitheatre and they reprised the old mountain kind of exercise of standing further and further apart and learning how to project your voice without shouting. So Philip stood right at the top of the amphitheatre and Richard stood right at the bottom. And they did it once more. And this is at the beginning of the 60s, whereas it was in 1943 that they'd really developed that.
Wow.
It was rather nice.
Um, their relationship possibly changing when Richard Burton finds film success and stardom, huge stardom. Once he starts dating Elizabeth Taylor, it just goes off the charts, and they're chased by paparazzi and all the rest of it. And I wonder, because I've read a lot about Richard Burton, I've read a lot of interviews and all the rest of it, and he did seem to have a love-hate relationship with acting. He's often quoted as saying, "I hate acting." And I wonder whether it was because at the time he's doing fairly awful films, a lot of the time for a lot of money. And I wonder whether he felt a sense of guilt to his mentor, that he'd turned his back on what his mentor sort of had planned for him.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know exactly, but I think that, yeah, I mean, things did change to a certain extent. There was, though, in 1964, a wonderful evening when Richard and Elizabeth did a benefit for AMDA, for the drama school that Philip was running in New York. And at the same theatre as during the week, Richard was breaking all records with Hamlet. One Sunday evening in the summer, they did this for, it was probably about 2 hours. They performed, and Elizabeth hadn't performed on stage live, since she was a child. Richard obviously had done much, much more. And Philip was the compere for the evening. And he introduced every recitation that Richard did. Richard would do a scene from Richard II, or they performed some poetry together. They did a wonderful rendition of the 23rd Psalm where Richard would do one verse in Welsh and Elizabeth the next verse in English. They had an audience had paid a fortune because it was to raise funds. And they also, with the Richard II scene, Philip introduced it by saying that this was the play that he had studied with his pupil in school back, in Port Talbot all those decades ago. So it was an amazing evening, and so there were events like that, and sometimes Richard and Elizabeth would come to AMDA, and do a performance or do something there. They helped out. They certainly helped it financially. So that they continued to be in touch throughout. But I think you do have a point in the sense that the pressures on Richard Burton when they were absolute superstars, Philip clearly wasn't seeing him all that often.
Yeah.
He was very fond of Elizabeth. And when Philip was dying in the mid 1990s in Florida, Elizabeth went to visit him, but in hospital. So, I mean, he carried on even after Richard and Elizabeth had broken up. Of course, they married twice. Um, Elizabeth would always send Philip, Christmas presents, and they remained in touch throughout. And so there was a sort of enduring friendship there, but clearly they had gone rather different ways. Philip was not impressed by Hollywood. He found it glitzy and not the kind of world that he really enjoyed. He also wrote novels. Well, he wrote no, he only wrote one novel, but he wrote five. No, he wrote several novels, but only had one novel published. But he did write a wonderful book about Shakespearean characters called The Soul Voice. He wrote five books, published five books in all. So he was a bit of a workaholic, and he was somebody who was a scholar. He was, and what's very interesting is that Chris Williams' editing of the Richard Burton diaries, and one of the things Chris talks about in that volume is what Richard really wanted to be was to be taken seriously as a scholar, an aspirant scholar, and to write and all of that. And of course, he kept that diary and he read avidly. And of course, on one level, what he seemed to want was to be what Philip had been.
Yeah, I totally.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. Yeah.
He's from.
Do you think that what did Philip enjoy most? Did he enjoy teaching drama or did he enjoy writing drama? Because he seemed to spend the second half of his life doing more writing. I know he was involved in this New York drama school,
Oh yeah, I
but
mean, it's difficult to tell. At different points, he enjoyed different things. I think he'd certainly had enough of school teaching after 20 years.
yeah.
Um, he did love the live theatre, so he wasn't as good an actor as he would have liked to have been. So there's a slight element of being thwarted there, but I think it's too simplistic to sort of just see him putting all his thwarted ambitions into Richard. I don't think it's quite as straightforward as that. He did carry on doing some acting. He did love directing, and I think he was good at that. But I think what he was also extremely good at was producing radio programs. I mean,
Mm.
he was very, very skilled at that. But I think that probably his greatest skill, although it might not have been what he recognized, was in imparting his knowledge and enthusiasm to others. And he
Mm.
also had an impact on several writers as well. So
Yeah.
I think that's what he bequeathed. I think his legacy was to inspire others. But I think he himself probably his Shakespearean recitals was one of the things that he loved the most. And
Mm.
in his late 70s in Key West, I mean, he'd gone to Key West, which is quite a bohemian, arty kind of place. It's totally different from the rest of Florida. And it attracts all sorts of interesting people. And in Key West, he was still giving these performance lectures. He was raising
Mm.
funds for the local church and for the art centre and various things. But he was still there on stage, acting out these parts and giving these amazing lectures about Shakespearean characters or about the plays. So I think
Mm.
that was what he really enjoyed doing. Um,
So
yeah.
Yeah. Do you think, sorry, Matthew, do you think that Richard Burton would have liked to have been a teacher? I did read somewhere that didn't he teach? He was like a, didn't he teach at one of the big universities, at Oxford or Cambridge, for like a term or half a term or something like that? And he
Well, yeah,
in
he
the
made a lot.
70s or something?
well, he made Dr. Faustus, and also um, in with Neville Coghill, who taught at Oxford and who had
Mm,
been when Richard had had the 6 months at Oxford. He was the person who helped him there with drama,
mm,
helped to get him into plays, and then Philip helped out. But he didn't really teach. I mean, he gave some advice very briefly in
mm,
about
mm, mm.
1966 to some
Yeah.
students. I
Okay.
don't think he really would have liked it. No, I don't think teaching was what he wanted to do, really. Um,
Mm.
I mean, in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, of course, he was an academic, but there's too much tendency, I think, to try and link parts to people. And I don't think what the one thing he did do when he was back, when he returned to school, very briefly, he did consider going to training college to teach.
Mm.
One of the things that he always said, because he spent quite a lot of time as a youngster in chapel, he went every Sunday to chapel, Welsh chapel, and he said he always learned quite a lot from recitation and from, he saw preachers as great actors.
Mm.
But I think even saying that he might want to teach was actually probably saying the right thing rather than him really necessarily meaning it.
Yeah.
What he did want was not to have to go back to the co-op to work.
Yeah.
And he
Well, you
wanted
certainly
to
managed that. Yeah.
have a job and a career.
Wonder whether he was saying the right thing when he once said that he'd give it all up to play one game for Wales as well.
I mean, he did love rugby, and but I mean, and you know, he followed Wales, and my brother runs Aberafan Rugby Club, which is the club he kind of supported. But I don't, I mean, that was, he was very good at exaggerating, and he also had
Mm.
very low, uh, I mean, he got bored quite easily. So I think quite often in interviews, and I talk about this in the book,
Yeah.
he would actually kind of liven things up a bit, sometimes by saying something outrageous, or sometimes by just simply something different, because,
Mm.
he was interviewed ad nauseum, and sometimes he just, you know, wanted to just either shock or delight or whatever. I mean, rugby really mattered, but I can't actually believe he would really have given up.
No, I, I've seen an interview that sort of you're alluding to here, where he's talking about his father as a coal miner and how much he venerated his father as a coal miner, and how there's this seam that goes from Wales all the way to Argentina under the sea, and how his father would look at the seam for a half an hour, get thick, and then look at it for a bit longer, and then he'd hit it with one almighty blow, and 20 tons of coal would fall down. And I thought it's a beautiful story, Richard, but that is not true.
I mean, his father was a great raconteur. He clearly got part of that from him, although
Yeah.
his father was an alcoholic, well, like Richard in one level. But his father, yeah, I mean, was a great storyteller, and they were both good at embellishment, shall we say? Yeah.
Well,
And
it's
with
part of being an actor, isn't it? You have to be able to tell a story, and the stories you tell are usually other people's, Angela, so, as an actor. So it's kind of so Philip, so he lived the rest of his life in Florida, did he?
Well,
After
he lived in New York for
Hmm.
several decades, and he then had two heart attacks. He was doing far too much. I mean, he was rushing around giving on the lecture circuit, giving these talks. He was still nominally responsible for running the drama school. He was writing, you name it. And not surprisingly, he had a heart attack.
Hmm.
Then a year later, he had another one. And so he recognized that the frenetic life of New York, really, he had to kind of, take things more slowly. And of course, the climate in Florida is very attractive. So
Hmm.
initially, he went there for the winter months, when it was cold in New York. Um, he also moved out to New Jersey briefly because he'd lived in various places in New York, but to try and sort of have a slightly less frenetic life. And then, he realised he just had to listen to what his doctor said, and so he went full time to Key West, which he loved, and he always said how happy he was when he was there. And he spent the rest of his life, I mean, the last few months he was in a home, but still in Florida, not far from where he was.
Once he went to America, did he kind of cut ties with Wales, or did he ever revisit? Or
He he'd had a fairly unhappy childhood because he'd never been close to his mother, who was an elderly mum. She'd been married once before. She had a son who was 18 years older than Philip and was a common
wow,
half brother. He
yeah,
did get on well with him, and he had children, the half brother, Will, and Philip was incredibly close to his daughter and her husband and Will, and they all went and stayed with him in the States, and he came back to Wales a number of times. But
mm,
after his heart attacks, he was wary of flying much. So
mm,
the last years, he didn't come back. However, his ashes were literally brought back to Mountain Ash and buried with his parents in the grave there. And
oh
I
wow,
opened the book with an account of me finding that grave.
that's wonderful.
So just I'm going to round out a little bit. I've had you almost an hour, Angela. This you might not have an answer for this question. It just popped into my head really, so I wrote it down. Um, is Dylan Thomas's poetry better in Welsh? Is Shakespeare more suited to the Welsh actor because of being a more poetic language? Grounded in sort of history. I mean, even the anthem, Land of My Fathers, it's got this kind of deep history to it, this sort of weight to it. I don't know. What
I
do you
don't,
think?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that. I there and Dylan Thomas himself didn't speak Welsh.
Really? I did not know that. That's
Yeah, his father was, but I don't think he was. Um, and I mean, Welsh is a very mellifluous language in some ways, and it's a very prolific language, an awful lot of words in it. Um, and it's, you know, difficult to tell. One of the things Philip did do was write several plays for radio about Shakespeare's links with Wales. And he had a Welsh teacher in grammar school. And so Philip did kind of make a case to a certain extent that he felt that some of Shakespeare's lyrical impulse, shall we say,
yes.
came from a Welsh influence. But I I don't know. I mean, I think I think many things sound very good in Welsh, but they can
Yeah,
also be good in English.
yeah,
So you got. Well, I got a question from Leighton, and now I've disappeared. Hopefully you can still hear me. Um,
yeah.
Leighton wants to know why Angela thinks Richard Burton never won an Oscar.
Oh, excuse me a sec. I'm going to have to just
Oh, major. Am I? Where did they go?
yeah.
No,
It said yeah, the battery. Why he never won an Oscar? Well, I don't. I mean, that's a difficult one, really, to know. He was nominated a number of times, and of course Elizabeth won an Oscar. It has been argued that in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, he allowed her somehow to, or he was encouraging her to put more into the part than he did himself. I'm not sure that I'm totally convinced by that.
I've never known an actor for that to be the case. So
Exactly. And I think that's kind of retrospective kind of thinking. Um, it's I don't know. I mean, he
well, a lot of
could.
it's political, isn't it, Angela? At the time, we have to go back to the individual. Yeah,
It's very political. Also, Richard was a drinker as well, whether that had some influence, but certainly, and Richard could annoy people if he wanted. He was somebody who spoke out and said what he believed. So he wasn't afraid of ruffling feathers if need be. And sometimes some of the Oscars go to some of the safe people, don't they?
yeah, I totally believe that's what it is myself, Matthew, is that he wasn't, it's a very political animal, isn't it? The Oscars always has been, even back then. And also, he's a man that said what he thought with conviction.
Yeah.
and was eloquent enough to kind of convey his thoughts in a very to the bone way. And you only have to piss off one person. And that's it, you know. It's one person in the academy of which the circles he would have been hanging around in, and that's kind of it. So yeah, I don't think Leighton who listens to this, I don't think that's any slight on his career. You know, definitely not. Yeah.
Well, as someone who once started a fist fight in BAFTA in LA, I definitely was no.
One thing that I think is interesting, people do talk a lot about the awful films he made, and there were some pretty bad ones, but actually he made more good films than most people would ever make.
Yeah,
Yeah.
You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
quantity there, but there is quality,
yeah.
and it's easy to forget that. I mean,
Yeah, but I like Angela, I like actors that do that. I like actors that, like if you look at Gary Oldman, you look at the films he did either side of the Winston Churchill thing, where he won an Oscar for. One of them was like Pacific Rim, like they were dreadful movies. But the way I see it is that his explanation, I'm an actor, I need to work, there's work, I'd go and do the work. Michael Caine was very similar. It was kind of like I take the work I get given, like, and I prefer that attitude than someone who's the guy that comes around every 7 or 8 years, grabs an Oscar, then goes again. You know the guy I'm talking about. What's his name?
Daniel Day-Lewis.
Daniel Day-Lewis. I much prefer to see an actor that you can go and see in any movie or act, that you can go and see on a theater on a Thursday night than an actor that's so precious that you just don't get anything for 5 years. Then you see a film and you don't. Do you know what I mean? I kind of like it that way. I think it's a little bit more down to earth. And so what if you do a bad movie now and again?
job, isn't it, in that sense? Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Angela. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Take care.
Bye.
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 That was pretty good, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So just to recap, she's written a book called Behind the Scenes. So, chronicling the dramatic lives in plural of Philip Burton, um, which is, yeah, it does sound like he led a fascinating life. I had no idea that Richard Burton lent on him so much.
Did I? I thought it was just a childhood thing.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So obviously it was a great deal of trust and also like, Angela referring to the fact that Philip didn't want to be a film director because it sounds like he could have been. I mean, if he was that close to him and being known as the guy that kind of to pull round plays and to get Philip to get Richard Burton on point whenever he stepped on stage, the film people that would have come to see the plays ultimately, would have been full of, it would have been the hottest ticket in town to get. Would have known this, and so he would have had opportunities, but he obviously stuck by his guns. And when Angela says he really wasn't into Hollywood, then you can really definitely say he really wasn't into Hollywood, and there's probably more the credit to him.
Yeah. Good
Yeah.
on it. All right, buddy. Well, I'll sign off. I'll say thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you to all our Patreon supporters. And we will crack on again next week. Good to see you, Dougie.
Yeah, you too, mate. Take care, everyone. Thanks.
Cheers, fellas. Bye.